debate. The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And let me begin by saying that I'll be splitting my time with the member for Peace River Westlaw. Now, this motion and the underlying Bill C-31 are effectively an admission of failure by this Liberal government when it comes to the economy and fighting inflation. Yeah. Now, to be very clear, Bill C-31 is setting up a national dental care program focused on children, and it also provides for some rent relief, $500 worth of rent relief, which doesn't go very far nowadays in most of our cities. But that's what this does. And I want to focus on that term relief. Why is relief even required in the first place? Something went wrong in the economy where this government decided, listen, we're going to have to borrow more money and send out checks because Canadians are suffering and falling behind. And why are they falling behind, Madam Speaker? There's a very clear reason. Inflation is rampant. And this government did not get a hold of the problem of inflation in a timely way. Now, I'll be the first to recognize that there are different things that have affected the inflationary pressures within Canada. We know that the global community has suffered from a COVID pandemic, which has disrupted everything in our lives. Our lives have been changed actually forever with this COVID pandemic. A pandemic that hadn't been experienced for over 100 years, and suddenly it was at our doorstep. Sure, that contributes to inflationary factors. Supply chain disruptions that occurred. The war in Ukraine. Weather-related challenges, whether it's drought and famine, whether it's storms, hurricanes, whether it's heat domes in British Columbia, all of this contributes to inflation. But there's one big factor that is very clearly in the control of this Liberal government, and that is its spending and its borrowing. Now, here's a factoid, Madam Speaker, which a lot of Canadians aren't aware of. Are you aware that over the last short 7 years, this Liberal government has spent more money than all previous governments in Canadian history combined? Going back to 1867, all the way to 2015, this Liberal government, in the subsequent 7 years, has spent more money than all of those governments combined. So now you know there is a problem. Now, some of that money was required to support Canadians during their time of need, during the COVID pandemic. That was a crisis that required a government response. But much of that spending was not actually COVID-related. We know that because a parliamentary budget officer said so. And if, in fact, the spending that this government did that has now accumulated a national debt somewhere in the order of $1.5 trillion, that spending that brought us to that point, much of which was not COVID-related, was effectively money that was pumped into the economy, more dollars chasing the same number of goods and services, and that drives inflation. Every credible economist will tell you that. If your productivity as a nation is not improving, which in Canada it is not, but you're pumping more liquidity into the marketplace, that is going to drive inflation. And I challenge this government to show me what steps it has taken to discipline, to restrain spending and the borrowing that was required to sustain that spending, much of which was not COVID-related. So, Madam Speaker, that's the first challenge I throw out there to my Liberal friends. Explain to me, where's the plan to control spending, that reckless spending that has taken place? And by the way, where's the plan to return to balanced budgets? And where's the plan to start repaying that massive debt that we've accumulated over the last few Liberal years? Explain to me how you justify to future generations of Canadians this massive debt in an environment of increasing taxes and increasing interest rates that those children and grandchildren are going to have to repay. I can't defend that to my children. I can't, Mr. Speaker. So, Madam or Mr. Speaker, what was even worse is that much of this COVID spending, the amount that was invested in relief programs and support programs, came through programs like CERB. They were poorly designed. So yes, fraud took place, much more fraud than should have taken place. The programs were designed in a way that people that actually didn't need the support got the support. And Mr. Speaker, I can speak from personal experience, having had constituents come into the office and say, hey, Ed, I applied for some of these benefits. You know that loan program of $60,000? I didn't actually need it, but now I only have to pay $40,000 back. $20,000 is forgiven. Why wouldn't I apply for it if I qualify? Why did Canadian businesses and individuals receive benefits that actually didn't need them during the COVID pandemic? In fact, some of these companies, during the COVID pandemic, because people had to stay at home, these were businesses that actually catered specifically to that kind of a situation. They made a ton of money. They've never made profits like that before. And yet they were applying for these benefits and receiving them from this Liberal government. That is a failure, Mr. Speaker. Then the question has to be asked. A government that cannot fix its passport system, a government that cannot deliver passports on time, a government that botches the ArriveCan app, and in fact pays $54 million for that app, when the private sector says it shouldn't have cost more than $1.5 or $2 million. When the government that came up with the failed Canada Infrastructure Bank and the CERB program, and I could go on and on and on, these programs that were absolute failures that this government couldn't deliver in an efficient, accountable manner, how is it that that government now expects to roll out a $10 billion national dental care program? Nobody in this country trusts this government to be able to manage that, to do it in a coherent and accountable way. So, Mr. Speaker, I know that I'm coming to the end of my time. I will just say this. Bill C-31 effectively is a Band-Aid solution to an underlying problem that is much more significant. That is a failure of this Liberal government to address the underlying causes of inflation. Effectively, Bill C-31 camouflages the real problem, and that is incompetence on the part of this government on the economic file, its inability to understand that it needs to control its borrowing and spending, its wild borrowing and spending, because that is what is driving inflation, at least in part. And I'll be fair, as I said at the beginning, some of the influences on inflation are not within Canada's control, but a very significant component is, and that is spending. So my challenge to this Liberal government, Mr. Speaker, is get your borrowing and spending under control. Then you might gain some credibility with Canadians when you roll out these expensive programs, multi-billion-dollar programs that are going to saddle future generations with permanent obligations. Don't do that to future generations. Canadians expect better. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.